Queer RelationTips, an iAmClinic podcast devoted to helping you, the LGBTQ plus community, create the love lives and relationships you crave.
Today's guest speaks with such clarity and depth that not only comes from their brilliance, but from walking hand in hand with suffering and sorrow, to reference one of my favorite books, Hind's Feet in High Places. There are some people who are just born with this wise sage integrated into the core of who they are. This person is nearly 10 years younger than me and like a million years more developed than me. I just find this person's insight and their depth to be so refreshing and stabilizing, even for the parts of me that still have questions and the parts of me that feel like I'm never going to figure life out. I am just enamored with the work this person is doing on the planet and the spoken word that they use. You'll enjoy it at the end of today's episode. Today's guest, I am utterly in awe of your depth and your bravery, and so thankful for your ability to be gentle as you teach us how to be better humans. Jamie and I had a wonderful time talking with today's guest. I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as we did. Let's take a listen.
Well, we kind of wanted to, I think as a Latinx person, gender nonconforming, sometimes gender non-binary, depending on the day, like just really interested to hear from other people of color from the queer community and kind of like what their experience has been. Because I feel like we walk a very particular path, and of course Jamie has their own way of introing themselves and talking about gender, but I think there's so many ways, like being a Latinx therapist with a master's degree is just, there's so many ways that I feel so odd in the world, and ways that because of that I feel beautiful and special. And so I just kind of wanted to spend time with you and just kind of see what it's like for you and your journey and kind of the ways you find your identities integrating. So yeah.
Okay. Well, as a Black, trans, non-binary person, it actually, my gender journey actually took me quite a long time, longer than it took me to like process my sexuality. And I think a lot of that just came from like not having access to representation, really. I didn't grow up with cable, and like I don't remember what channel the L Word was on, but it wasn't on whatever we had, like there wasn't really a lot of like queer representation in television when I was a kid. And I feel like as a Black person, I feel like one of the things that was most difficult for me in trying to parse through my gender identity was that I was sexualized from a very young age by people around me. So I didn't really understand exactly like that was part of what was making me so uncomfortable, and like experiencing a lot of dysphoria and just general anxiety and uneasiness as a kid. But that was definitely something that, looking back, I can say like that really had a profound impact on how I perceived my own gender, and perceived the power of clothing. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers or if that's like a good like starting point, but that's kind of what came to me thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to share a little bit about yourself, Jamie? Kind of give some context.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's so nice to meet you. Isaac and I went to graduate school together, and I started working for iAmClinic about 1.5 years ago, and really passionate in working with the LGBTQ community. And I identify as gender non-binary. And I think kind of that process really started emerging for me, a few years ago. And I think it was really liberating, and I connect to a lot of similar things that you're sharing. Obviously, it's a different journey in many ways, but I think for me, it was just this realization that, I didn't have that language growing up. I would have probably understood myself a lot better in terms of the way that I functioned in the world if there was like kind of at least a third orientation available at the very least, if not more. And so I think what was kind of big for me in that process was just understanding that either body type would feel like very much at home for me. And the just that sense of kind of having both substances poured into the same glass. And it was really liberating to be able to kind of have that integration come to the forefront for me. And so yeah, I really appreciate everything that you just shared as well. And I'm super interested just kind of in how it emerged for you, like this awareness of all of your identities. But as you're talking about gender specifically right now, like how and when that kind of emerged for you. And I was also struck when you talked about the power of clothing, which I also find really interesting walking in the world as a non-binary person. So if you don't mind, you can share a little bit more about that. I would love to hear.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I first got language to talk about gender in a more expansive way as a high schooler on Tumblr. So that was actually the first place where I came out gender-wise. Was just on the internet with my friends that I only talked to on the internet, because not very many of my friends in the real world were into Tumblr at the time, so it felt safer. And yeah, but I remember it was really hard for me to kind of come to the realization that I did identify sometimes more masculine, just having not having grown up really around very many men or people who identified that way, who I trusted or who I felt like were good role models for me. So I kind of just put it on the back burner and was like, I'll deal with this eventually, but right now I'm just trying to get through high school.
Sure.
But I've always really loved clothing. I remember when I first started to pick out the clothes that I wanted to wear to school, I have this perfect image in my head of me maybe 11, wearing some cargo shorts, and I thought that the striped fake rugby shirts from Old Navy, I was like, this is the coolest shit actually. I'm actually the coolest looking kid in second, fifth grade. So I remember I a lot of my confidence would come through from my clothing. I was a pretty introverted person and still am, but I like to think that my clothes say something for me.
Mm-hmm.
I love fashion. I love studying it. I if you show me a piece of clothing, I could probably guess which designer made it. I love it. And I find this juxtaposition, and I'm gonna just be kind of vulnerable, because I think this is part of my own gender identity, where I still feel kind of almost novice. So I'll just describe it. I feel like as a therapist, and part of my whole journey as coming out in the religious context I did was really trusting, not only it was trusting what my body was telling me, but then there was this direct result, looking at a female, yeah, okay, maybe kind of attractive, but then looking at a male, it was whoa, and then my body responded, my heart would increase or whatever it might be. And that was really reliable. But I think sometimes with gender, it's for me, when I wear clothing, it helps pull out the feminine or the masculine. But I think sometimes it's harder for me to trust. It's harder for me to trust the internal experience because it's not so actualized.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I feel like clothing plays a big part, and I feel sometimes, is that trustworthy?
Mm.
Because I put so much emphasis on, like, how do I, as a therapist, like internal worth and inherent value, and it feels like a false positive to feel my body resonate with the clothing that I'm wearing, but it shouldn't be.
Mm. Mm.
So if you guys could give me your
Mm.
experience with that, the reliability or the trusting nature of clothing.
Mm.
I think for me, what that brings up is a lot of the the discord that I feel walking through the world doesn't actually come from like internal dysphoria. It comes from other people's perception of me, right? Like I present differently at different times, but like I do enjoy, you know, like wearing a nice sundress when I do, and it's like super fucking hot like today. But it's like the way that I feel wearing whatever piece of clothing is not necessarily how other people seeing me wear that clothing think of me. Like I remember I had a moment in a class a while back where I realized that my classmates were not using he and they for me. They were using only they. And if I was ever presenting in a more like feminine way, then it was just like my pronouns didn't exist at all.
Mm.
And it's like that weird invisibilizing that happens because of other people's perception, you know? Like it's like like my internal identity is stable, even though my outward presentation is like flexible, fluid, whatever. But like I feel like what's been a struggle for me is like realizing just how like ingrained that is, even in communities that, you know, want to be more affirming or be more supportive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so well said. Thank you. I always find anytime talking about you know, these kinds of things with other people, it's just healing in its own way. Just, you know, I think this is like one of the things I've actually had a lot of process and struggle with. It was interesting when I first started coming out, because a lot of times people, the first question that they would ask me was actually more like, so are you going to start to dress more masculine? And like, not really. I mean, I kind of dress a little bit more in between anyway. But for me, it was a fascinating concept, and in some ways I resonate. And maybe this is how I interpreted what you were saying, Zeb, was that there was still a binary, right? It was kind of like I'm coming out as trans non-binary, meaning like I'm pretty like comfy in like a transitional middle that like kind of, you know, takes different forms depending on you know, where I'm at on a regular basis. But I think the expectation was somehow that I would cross over, right, to another side, or show some or somehow present differently. And I think it was just sort of an interesting concept of people, you know, really wanting there to be some kind of cue, right, that helps them to know or have a recognizing, you know, factor around my differing identity. And I do think it's a fascinating process too, in terms of how we present, because I would never ever say that the pain or the loneliness that I've experienced sometimes would be the same as someone who's going through the process of trying to pass and is really struggling because they actually do want to present as like another gender completely. But I think the pain and the loneliness does come in some ways from the invisibility, because there's not really a way to present as both at the same time, or at least I haven't found a way to do that. And it's led to a lot of really interesting internal processes. And I really agree with that, with what both of you said around the internal is stable, right? But then there's kind of this externalizing factor that feels a little less stable. um, and just how quickly, it's a difficult process, right? And it's been a challenge for me even sometimes to correct people, just because this was such an internal integration for me that I kind of almost don't want it to always be a thing. But people mess up a lot on my pronouns. And it's just been a fascinating process of feeling so much more aware and connected to my internal self, but feeling a little bit of a disconnect, with the external world in a way that I hadn't really connected with before. So and I have a lot of beef about all of that too, just because I also realize the privilege of being in a female body, that when I dress in a way that would be culturally masculine in our society, like there's no like kind of like pathologizing of that, right? But if my husband, for example, were to like show up to work wearing a skirt or something, people would raise an eyebrow and wonder about that. And it's like, why? Why does that have to be the indication? And he doesn't identify as non-binary, right? But why isn't he allowed to do that? So anyway, I feel like I'm going on too long, but this is obviously like something that I find very interesting and struggle with. And even things like, how I wear my hair and what am I wearing today? And does that actually feel like it represents my internal world very well? And it's an interesting process when it's both. So
I think part of it for me is the idea that clothing can come across as contributing to vanity. And then saying,
Mm.
if this piece of clothing that I wear can categorize me as vain, then is it also unreliable to trust it as an expression of my gender?
Hmm.
Am I explaining that well?
Like if you're
I got to just sorry.
go
Could you
ahead.
speak more about like what you mean by vanity?
Yeah, so something like if I'm wearing a t-shirt, it's like it's a chill day, right? Like I'm going to clean my bathroom and organize my refrigerator. But then if I put on a crisp button up, it means I'm going to go to a fancy restaurant. And I feel like or like if someone were to say I'm wearing a Dolce and Gabbana shirt, this somehow means that I'm better than someone who's wearing a button up from Target. Obviously that's not true, but I think some people hold clothing as a symbol of vanity. And then to, in a sense, say, is it vain then for me to use clothing to feel different in one sense as better than someone else, but then in another sense as gender non-binary? I'm answering my own question as I'm talking about this, but I feel like there's a hesitance to use clothing as an expression of gender because it's felt associated with the vanity piece in my head, for whatever that's worth. But then I flip the coin and I think, because I do love fashion, it's an incredible way of expressing what's on the inside. And I guess part of my rationale here is, are there other ways we can express gender if not with clothing? Because it feels more sacred than just using clothing as a way of expression.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, what I'm trying to explain.
I resonate with that a lot. I think it's kind of that idea of like internal versus external regulation, and in a lot of ways. And I think you brought this in when you first asked the question, was like, especially in our field or in the world, there's that sense of, you know, almost kind of like really looking more toward like how are you internally regulating, right? How is your internal world telling you about yourself? How are you able to like process through that? And so then lots of things around external regulation are labeled like superficial or materialistic, or all of these negative terms. And so it's an interesting process when you're kind of going through an internal awareness of how you experience gender, but wanting to express that externally. It's kind of like this, like, internal, like it's a battle, right? Where you're kind of like, but I'm internally regulated. I don't need this to regulate my gender. I don't need to use clothes to regulate my gender, but I'd like to use them to express it. That is something I resonate with and struggle with a lot myself. In many different ways, and it's taken a lot of different forms, right? Where it's like, what am I trying to say when I wear this, and do I feel comfortable wearing this today, that kind of idea. If I wear something that's almost too feminine, that feels kind of weird to me, because even though I like how it looks, it doesn't feel like it represents my internal world. And then I get annoyed that that's the case, and that something that looks that way could have that kind of power to, like, influence what I choose to do. So I don't know if that's kind of what you were getting
Totally.
at. But.
Yeah, because I feel like there might be a day where I'm wearing, I don't know, a flannel, right? And boots. It's winter or whatever. And I feel like the femme part of me is such a gift to the world that it drives me crazy that people would assume I don't bring that beautiful femme part with me.
Exactly.
And I feel almost like I'm betraying my gift if I'm using the wrong clothing. And then I get angry that it's all, the perception is based on what I'm wearing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I think that I feel like that, or at least the way that shows up for me, is a lot of like conversation around like safety, right? Like, it's not actually safe to wear whatever you want whenever you want.
Yeah.
Especially like me as like a relatively like short Black person. Like, people think I'm a teenager all the time and like talk to me any kind of way, like it can get really slippery for me when I'm presenting femme if I'm not pitching my voice up, because men are shit a lot of the time. But like, I feel like for me, I don't really like to think about the word vanity when associated with clothing, because I think especially for like a lot of young Black and brown queer trans folks who like, may not have grown up with a lot of stability, like clothes is like the one thing that you can, like, no one can take your style from you, like that is like something that can't be policed, like like Black children in a park laughing, getting told by white moms to like be quiet, like blah blah blah, or like people like to say the shittiest things about how Black and brown women and femmes like to do their hair or their nails or put on makeup or not put on makeup. Like, I feel like there's so much that is like taken as like an indicator of your worth associated with like your physicality as a Black person, that like I'm really hesitant to call any acknowledgement and like celebration in the face of that. I'm not going to call that vanity.
I love that reframe.
Me too.
I think for me, it comes from the idea that I was better off staying small. And so anything flashy felt like I was betraying my role. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, I feel like it just plays into this false narrative of like, oh, well, if you act A, B, C, or you do XYZ, then nothing bad will happen to you, you know? And it's like that, those rules, at least for me, are a lot of times passed down by by family members or elders or like people who care about you, but like they know and you know that like you could do all of those things and anything could still happen to you. It's like a false sense of control.
I agree. There's like I always say this because I think it's a good way of orienting, but I'm very small and I felt like I can wrap my fingers around my ankles. And then I think about like wearing my favorite green tunic um, as a dress and going to King Super, a grocery store that we have here in Denver, King Supers, and thinking like if I wear this, like I'm afraid that I'm just going to get beat up. Like I would love to express my gender, but I'm afraid to actually wear this thing in public, you know, and I think that's one of the things that keeps me most hesitant more than anything.
Hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a moment to let you know about a unique opportunity Queer RelationTips is offering. Over the past 10 years, I've sat with people and couples and walked them through some pretty difficult times. We all want thriving lives, but creating the love lives and relationships we crave is a journey, and Queer RelationTips wants to help you on that journey. We're accepting inquiries from those who want to come on the show and sit with a therapist and gain some insight into their struggles. Whether that's helping you find peace with your identity, ways to emotionally handle an unsupportive or critical family, help getting past roadblocks in your sexual relationships, or maybe ways to save your relationship that you fear is headed for disaster, we're here to help. For more information about how to become a guest, visit www.iamclinic.org/queer-relationtips. That's iamclinic.org/queer-relationtips. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the show.
I'm kind of curious from both to kind of hear from both of you. How has how have your different orientations, you know, and maybe it's just focusing right now on your gender orientation or whichever way it is that you want to go. How has that impacted the relationships in your life, and also, you know, when you're forming new relationships, friends, you know, if there's romantic partners, like any of that kind of stuff? How's that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's I always say it this way because I think it gives a lot more context, but I always say in my sexual orientation, I identify as bisexual, but culturally, I identify as gay. Because I think that delineates for me this idea that I might, I doubt it, but I could have been partnered with a woman, but I would not have wanted to live in the heterosexual culture, if that makes sense, because I feel like then I would stereotypically be more inclined to be forced to talk with men who want to talk about sports at a family get together, you know, or whatever. But to be partnered with a man then means I get to still feel at home in my gay culture. So I think that really predicts the way that I create friends and the type of friends that I choose to surround myself with, because I'm more comfortable in that gay culture. Yeah, I think that's maybe one way that I see it happening for me.
Makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Isaac. I guess I would say like gender identity, the way my gender identity has impacted my relationships. I grew up in a very culturally conservative like context, and any acts of like gender transgression that I did as a child or young person, I was like very much punished for, and not even always understanding that was the source of the punishment was the gender transgressing. But I would say that, like, in the past couple of years, I don't know. I don't really know how it's impacted my relationships. Like, I don't know how it impacts the other person in the relationship, but it has
Mm,
like been a big strain on my relationship with my family.
mm,
Um, it's like I'm not close to very many people in my family of origin, but the ones I am close to often don't really get the pronouns with a name necessarily. Um, but it feels like yeah, it hurts, but like it's okay. It's like I would rather have this connection than nothing. I guess that's kind of been um, how I've looked at relationships in the past. Like I'd rather have this than nothing, um, and that has been not great, to be
mm,
honest.
mhm,
I think another piece of it for me is like, um, I really try to seek out, like, I love New York City. And I think for me, I try to seek out more cosmopolitan people because I feel like um, all of the various parts of my being, I feel more safe when I know that someone is coming from a more cosmopolitan paradigm because then I get to be like a Latinx person who's educated, who's also queer. Because sometimes here in Denver, it's really easy to find the people like the cisgender straight white person who won't be able to respect or see the various parts of me. And so it gets really uncomfortable trying to like code switch.
mm.
And after 36 years, almost 37,
Mhm.
I just get so tired of only being educated Isaac in certain places or only being
Mm,
um, masculine Isaac in others. And it's like, it just gets, because I am so in love with who I am, it just feels like I hate leaving out parts of myself in the car to code switch when I'm in certain paradigms.
yeah.
So I think that really affects the way that I'm constantly maybe even subconsciously assessing and kind of scanning relationships to say, am I my totality truly welcome here? Or do
Mhm.
I have to leave a part of me out or teach someone about part of who I am? And that just gets kind of old after a while.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that phrase resonates of scanning relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think that's a really good phrase for how it feels sometimes to kind of figure out, right? Is this a situation where I do come out or I don't come out? If I do come out, how much energy do I need to put into the education around that? And then also, um, how much, what happens kind of afterward, right? And yeah, it's been an interesting process for me. It has put some tension in relationships that are still really, really good and really, really positive, or have been some of my best, support systems. It's elevated other relationships, like in my marriage. It's elevated my relationship. I would say my husband probably is one of the absolute best people at using my pronouns, and also asking about my experience on a regular basis, which I'm really, really thankful for. But then there's been a lot of people where it's just sort of almost like a burden, right, for them to use my pronouns, or it feels like there's a lot of kind of forgetting, and then I have to kind of gauge that, right? Do I bring it up? Do I not bring it up? How much do I push this? And lots of friends where it's kind of like I came out to them, and there's a little bit of the okay, not a big deal, but still not really addressed, not really curious. And I think that's been interesting too. Is like I've learned a lot about how healing curiosity can be, in the right context when people actually ask questions. Like I'm newly a mother now, and just even having people ask questions around like, what is that like for you as a non-binary person, is super rare, super rare. But when it happens, it's really healing. And when people use my pronouns correctly, that's also really healing. Like it actually literally feels like soothing to like my internal person, in a way that was really, surprising to me when I first came out. And so that's actually increased this interesting dynamic of people who are normally very like soothing or healing for me, but aren't in that area, right? Because they are not utilizing my pronouns on a regular basis. And a lot of times not on purpose, right? It really is like their brain is just having a super hard time with it. But yeah. So it was just an interesting thing I was curious about, and I appreciate both of you sharing on that level too.
So we went to seminary as well. That's where our master's degrees are from. And I'm really excited for you, especially in what you're doing. Like just, like Broderick Greer, in the work that he's doing. Like I feel like to be queer person of color in a religious space it's incredible. I was guest lecturing at a class not too long ago, and it was a trans person who had grown up in Christian household and then left Christianity. And one of the questions they asked, and they were very angry, was, why would you support anybody, a queer person, who stays in a system that's oppressive? And they were referring to a gay Christian. And the anger really caught me off guard, and I totally get why the anger was there. But I didn't say this in front of the class, but I do think that there is something to be said about reformation, about claiming what is important and staying to fight to protect it for other people, and to reform it in a way that it's safe for generations to come. And I think that that's one of the most beautiful pieces. So I'm excited to see where you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. If there was a Black trans kiddo who might be thinking of seminary or coming out, or moving into spaces to better themselves that might be antagonistic or unwelcoming or just flat out prejudice, what have you learned about your own courage or your own strength that they might need to know about themselves?
Don't let anybody treat you like you don't deserve to be where you are. And you deserve to take up space. Because the cis-het white dudes who are going to be in all your classes have no problem with raising their hand to give a 12-minute tangent when they didn't even read the book. So that means that you are so much more important than some stupid fucking grade. Just keep it pushing.
Yep.
And high school is not the end of the world. Actually, it's actually not. The rest of life is not like high school.
Yep. Sounds like that advice is in some ways still kind of resonating in you, like kind of using that, like, come on, you can do it.
Yeah.
One more step.
And I would also say, like, don't trust anybody who says they have it all figured out. Because nobody does. Nobody knows what the fuck they're doing. Not a single fucking person knows what they're doing.
That is some good advice, actually. I mean, all of it, but that is like right at the core.
Like, don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. No program is gonna fix your life.
Right. It's a very compassionate equalizer.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows.
I love what you're saying here, because I feel like in my uneducated background, right? Like uneducated. My mom was illiterate till she was 21, and my dad dropped out of high school and then later got his GED through the GI Bill as a Marine. And so my parents are incredibly brilliant people without the formal academic training. And so we, in my family, I grew up in many ways learning how to love and loving so well. And then entering academia and then becoming a business owner and feeling so incredibly inadequate. And then to say, but what I know of my collectivistic Latinx family and how we know how to love deserves to be, it's a lesson for the world. And I love this idea of like, take up space, like I deserve to be here. And maybe the lessons that I bring from my culture are maybe what I'm here to disseminate in a sense. And to really have learned to feel confident in that message, in being a business owner who is bringing a different dynamic, a therapist who's teaching a different skill set from my culture, I think is it's been liberating, because we live in an individualistic society. And to bring that collectivistic approach to relationships, I feel like would change the world. And I guess I kind of find myself wondering, what is it to you, Phil, that needs more space, or you're proud that it has taken up so much space?
I mean, honestly, I think the thing that I bring to conversations and to spaces is we cannot, as a people, continue to refuse to acknowledge our trauma. And we can't keep refusing to process it either, or name it. Like, if we really want to walk through the door that's being presented, where like on the other side things are not, this is the worst that it got, if this is going to be the worst that it gets, there's a whole lot of shit we're gonna have to talk about. A lot of shit we have to talk about. And I think that what I bring is that you can have a very complex relationship to your trauma, and it doesn't mean that you survived wrong, or that you somehow deserve whatever happened. And you're also not the only one. Just like, we can't, like, I feel like that's kind of what this first year of seminary has been for me. Like, one of the last papers I wrote was on just kind of like a reflection on how ridiculous I find it that so many of the philosophers who are considered the classics, how we never talk about the fact that these people universally support pederasty as just like a way of like initiating oneself as a citizen, as like a wealthy, elite, powerful member of society. Like, we invisibilize trauma, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of the people that we say we look up to. And when we do that, we just cheapen everything. Like, you can't just pick and choose, separate the art from the artist like a million times a fucking day. Like, if an artist is a rapist, then they're a rapist. If a candidate is a rapist, he's a rapist.
Right. The courage that you have to make those conversations and to take up that space is so palpable. I know people won't see this because they're only going to hear the audio, but like, as I'm watching you, the word that comes to mind is like warrior. Like,
Mm.
and I'm glad that you're taking up this space because it needs to be occupied.
Thank you.
You do have a way of really speaking with power, but also invitation. And I think that's pretty amazing, actually. There's a powerful message, but I also feel drawn in and welcome to engage. And I feel like that's really rare. And I know that it really comes from a lot of the things that, you know, at least from how it comes across to me, a lot of the things that you've had to go through yourself. But there's a way in which at least I experience you in the short time I've gotten to meet you. It's just very compassionate and still wanting to connect, even when it's hard.
Thank you.
So
Thank
I
you, both
appreciate
of you.
Yeah.
I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but do you have a poem nearby that you'd like to read?
Let's see. Okay.
This is a treat. I always like, when I met you in New York, I was like, more, I want more.
I'm so excited.
Okay, well, I actually have, I rewrote a mourner's Kaddish. I'm Jewish, and this prayer is said after someone has died, and also like in community with people who are mourning. And a lot of the translations that you see online are like super masculine. And I kind of wanted to return to like this like embodied feminine, like mystical aspects of God. So I'll just read this. Kaddish. May the textures of the divine, the breadth of her soul be ever exalted. May she be praised, her feet warmed in my lap. May the world she created, where we feed each other, where we sleep in the grass without worrying, where medicine flowers coax healing, true as honey, ripen. May the sense of its skin elicit desperation. May I never cease longing for the shadow in the hollow of her throat, somehow strongest as the fragrant taste of her salt. Her minerals, her metals, and all other matter pass my lips to smolder on the velvet of my tongue. Anticipated, awaited, edified, adored, adorned, precious Holy One. Behind the beyond, there is another. Beneath what is said, there is a cellar. Between all you, may sound sleep never be a stranger. Weaver, spinner, needle guard, patch the scorched flesh of my palms. You are the sweet smoke clinging to my robes.
Oh, thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
I just feel like you're in such the right place. I hope that your studies will produce some great work, but I just feel like your skill set and how you want to take up space is like, I mean, you got it. Yeah, for sure. Your gift with words and to create those conversations and to present stuff, it's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for your time today.
Of course. Yeah, this is really fun. Thanks for inviting me.
there's something about the guest, and I know the guests from different seasons of my life that just feels so powerful. There's a depth and a brilliance that just kind of flows out and just lands, and it kind of silently changes your world.
Yes.
And I really respect the guest. And I was thinking about this often, but I think they're brilliant. I think he's brilliant. But I also think you acquire that kind of knowledge by a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm.
And to be a Black, queer, trans person, you're going to know a lot about how the world functions and how
Mm-hmm.
good it can be, but also how painful it can be.
Yes.
And sometimes pain is an amazing teacher, but also then to give credit to the pain that just forged such brilliance and depth and insight and beauty.
Yes.
Um, I'm a therapist, and by no means am I the Maharaja or the wise sage of the world, but our guest always teaches me something, always.
Mm-hmm.
And they're more than 10 years younger than me, and I just love being with him.
Yeah, I agree. I had such a similar experience, and it's kind of interesting. It's the first time I met our guest, but I can validate and say that that concept, right, of invitational power, of power that comes from a very deep place that invites people to engage and to think and to examine in a way that could be, very transformational, right? It's non-shaming, which I think is really important, and especially nowadays. I think there's a way to influence and invite people into introspection, into change, without shaming. And our guest, I feel like, really embodies that, which I just really appreciated and admired and really enjoyed witnessing and just dialoguing. And you're right. I think that there's a way in which our guest has had to really fight, in the world to stay as anchored as they are. And through that really does provide a sense of, oh, okay, here I am. I'm like in this moment now, right? I feel more anchored in the conversation. I feel more anchored by their presence. And it's just going to be, I guess, really neat to see how that continues to unfold as they continue to take up space and step into the world more and more, especially after, their training. I mean, they're already doing it, but it's going to be a force to be reckoned with in the most beautiful way.
Yeah, I really resonate with that shame piece that you mentioned, like really calling out shame without shaming. And he even did it for me.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this, and I brought up this, this insecurity of mine around clothing and the vanity of it. And just very gently, he said, I don't want to shame the clothing of any person. I'm not quoting him directly, but it was kind of like, oh yeah, Isaac, that's shame. I was like, oh yeah, thank you. You're right. That is coming from a shame-based part of me.
Right.
And it's been a lesson that I've learned before, but I had to be reminded one more time to say how I choose to express myself isn't vain, it's authenticity.
That's right.
And I shouldn't feel sorry for needing to be authentic. And it was just so sweet the way he delivered it, and just kind of called me out without calling me out. But again, I just feel like there's so much to learn from someone who has been taught by pain, because it not only teaches us to find our pain, but also to say, I'm in some ways the culprit. I might be creating pain. whether out of my own shame or out of my naivety
Yeah.
or my privilege.
That's right. And I think kind of even that piece that you shared, even in the episode, I felt the same way. And I think it's an interesting thing when we do speak with a sense of, authority, but that's not condemning. It then creates, again, that invitation, like what you talked about with shame, where if somebody were to speak to you about vanity from kind of their own shame or condemnation because they hadn't reconciled what it is or something like that, it just would have caused more, right? And it would have for me too. But there's a way in which it's like, no, like I'm not going to call it vain. That kind of invited parting ways, right? That's what happens. Like when we engage pain and gain freedom, then we also are inviting other people into gaining freedom too. And it's a fine line. It's an interesting thing, right? Because something that I've always thought about, and I did this a lot more when I was in my clinical training, was the concept of iron sharpening iron, right? And as a therapist, it's a fascinating process when you're going through training because you're trying to figure out, how do I help people, but also how do I form a bond and an alliance so that way they know they can trust me? And how do I do that in a way that's authentic? But then also, how do I deal with all of my own insecurities when I'm especially new into something? And it just gave me just a really important time of examination where it's like, okay, if somebody is coming to me, they're coming to me as a therapist for honesty and for feedback that is administered in a way that's so deeply caring. But if I'm not going to be iron, there's no sharpening that'll happen. Like if I basically kind of fall away and I don't say anything that's contrary to what the belief system might be, or if I don't point certain things out, right, in a very kind and gentle way, then change won't occur, right? And I think the beautiful thing that happens though is that goes both ways, right? Because then that sharpens me as a person. And I think that was just an example of I'm not going to try to say what the direction the conversation is going. I'm going to say what I think, and then that created sort of this sharpening effect that was really potent. And I think it's just a really cool way to model, right, how we can be in the world with one another, because we can really help one another a lot by kind of sharpening those edges, but we can do it in a way that's gentle, so that it actually invites that parting with things that we don't need to hold on to.
I love this. Like, you're giving me goosies, as J-Lo would say. Like things are happening over here. But yeah, part of me, the way that I've never thought of it this way until you said this, but iron sharpens iron, and we have to show up as iron. And that takes me to kind of one of the things I love to say is that vulnerability breeds vulnerability.
Exactly.
And if I'm going to show up as iron, sometimes that means I'm going to do the sharpening, but it also means I might be the one being sharpened, and that requires vulnerability. To say, hey, I'm still struggling here. I don't quite understand my gender identity. Can you teach me a little bit more? Even if you're the guest on the podcast and I'm the therapist, like I still need other humans, and there's nothing more enlightened about me in every facet of life, you know? And so I love that. Thank you for that. Like, that's really, I'm going to carry that for a long time.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate that piece, right, of really kind of an insight into the fact that, as therapists, we're human too, and it creates this ripple effect, right, of in order for us to invite vulnerability, we've had to be vulnerable ourselves. And in order for, there to be this ability to compassionately, connect or compassionately confront, we have to have been confronted, I think. Maybe not about the exact same topic, but in a very similar way. And so, yeah, it takes humility and vulnerability to kind of live that way. And it's nice when you encounter it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And that also, if we show up as iron, that doesn't mean we're showing up as the hammer, we're not here to try to kind of like crush people or like pulverize them down to dust, and we also don't need to feel that way, right? We don't need to feel like we're going to be put down to dust if we get brushed up against. But yeah, it just is really neat when we encounter people like our guest who embody that. It's always something I deeply admire and appreciate and take with me as well. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah. I think we have the coolest job on the world because we're constantly iron. We're either the ones sharpening, or
that's right,
we're being sharpened by our clients to say like, oh my God, that client just taught me a lot about love, and I didn't know that love could be that deep.
Yeah, exactly.
But to see the love for their kiddos, or the love for their partner, or the love that they had for the person they're grieving, like, whoa. Yeah. Is there anything that stood out for you as someone who identifies as gender non-binary with our guest?
I think the thing that I always appreciate is being able to share about some common experiences. I think that is always a healing experience in life in general. It's that concept of we do need each other, and we need people who are similar and walking in a similar way, but are doing so differently, obviously, in order to just kind of feel a little bit more connected to ourselves. There's sort of that both and that comes from that. And it's always healing. It's healing to be able to just like openly talk about it and have a sense of like, oh, you get it. And of course, not in a way that is going to be, from a lens of conformity versus unity. You know what I mean? Like there's a way in which I experience my gender that's going to be different than our guest, for sure, even though we both are under this like kind of umbrella term of non-binary. And I think that's just kind of true as humans in general. It's definitely true within the queer community. I mean, I think in some ways that's sometimes the hardest part, right? About coming out, is you come out hoping to then fit in. And then you find actually, oh, being a lesbian is different for me than it is for this other person I know who identifies as lesbian, or being transgender is different for me than somebody else I know. But there's going to be threads that connect us. And so I think what stood out to me was just, the threads that connect us. And I just loved, the insights, that they shared, and just the ability to kind of feel like, okay, we get to just talk about this for a little while.
Something that's not talked about very often.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. I think that's refreshing. So it's just something to inspire, hopefully, our listeners as well, that, find people that you can talk about it with. Whatever it is.
Yeah. Yes. To today's guest, thank you. That I just carry so much gratitude and love for you, and I can't wait to see all that you do.
Absolutely. Such a joy.
Queer RelationTips is a podcast sponsored by iAmClinic, a counseling practice devoted to the LGBTQ+ community with in-person and virtual counseling options available. iAmClinic. Create the love lives and relationships you crave. Find us online on Instagram at LGBTQ_therapy and Facebook at iAmClinic. That's iAmClinic.